Now, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to make a presentation to the owner of the Los Angeles Wolves and the man who has sponsored the Wolverhampton Wolves this year, Mr. Jack Kent Cooke. Would you like to say a few words?
And when we decided to start soccer here in America, I was warned constantly that this is a dull game. Isn't it one of the most exciting games you've ever seen in your life? There isn't a writer in Hollywood, there never has been one, who could have written a script for the game tonight. Next year, the year after, and all the years to come, we're going to be proudly privileged to bring you wonderful fans, Major League Soccer here in Los Angeles, and thank you so much.
And we know all of the United Soccer Association owners share Mr. Cooke's sentiments. They feel privileged to be able to present professional Major League Soccer throughout North America. The spectacular match you've just watched is indicative of the type of soccer you'll see played in the United Soccer Association.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, friends, how's it going? All right, let's get this going, shall we? It's Tim Hanlon, your congenial host for another fun-filled episode of Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey into what used to be in professional sports. Thank you once again for joining us. If it's your first time here, welcome. Have a seat. Wherever you are, give a listen, and hopefully we'll entertain you for a little while. And if you've come back for another episode after having heard some others, we can't appreciate your patronage enough for coming back. Thanks for doing so. Today we're stumbling and rumbling back to soccer, pro soccer, but a very important inflection point for the history of professional soccer in this country. And we take you back through the time machine, the Wayback Machine, to the mid-1960s, when a bunch of things were congealing together to essentially create, seemingly out of thin air, but if you're paying attention, the seeds of some true development of what became the first real substantial modern approach and attempt to bring top-tier professional soccer to this here country, the United States. A couple of things were happening. You had, in the early 60s, this thing called the International Soccer League, which essentially was an assemblage of top-tier, full foreign teams from Europe and South America playing in a tournament, mostly in the New York area, but it expanded a little bit as the years went on. But televised, certainly locally, a little bit nationally as well. An entrepreneur who we'll talk about by the name of Bill Cox. He a controversial figure and one, frankly, of the only people still historically today, although he's long gone, banned from the sport of baseball. And we'll talk about why he was such a controversial figure. But he was the guy who was bringing in teams and drawing great crowds, mostly amongst the ethnic population of top-tier soccer talent and teams and competition in the United States through most of the early 1960s. 1966, interestingly, was also an interesting event in that the World Cup was really, for the first time, broadcast in its entirety, the final at least, here in the United States. Not live, but pretty darn close in, I think it was a 2-hour delay, narrated by football legend broadcaster Jim Simpson. I'd love to find a copy of that tape if it exists. I'll put that out there to our listeners. But NBC did run in its entirety a very thrilling 1966 World Cup final across the United States. And it did pique the interest. It got quite a good rating. The curiosity was palpable. England obviously winning that tournament, and it did set a few things in motion, including Mr. Cox, who saw what he hoped was the next step in his soccer journey and his business venturing, and that was to create, in his mind, a professional top-tier league in the United States. Of course, he wasn't the only one with that idea. There were at least two other groups in addition to his that sort of seemingly popped out of nowhere in 1966 to essentially attempt the big dollars, or at least they thought they saw big dollars, by trying to bring top-tier professional soccer and league to the United States. We'll talk about all of that, the messy beginnings, the messy middle parts, the dire straits after this crazy period of time from roughly late 1966 to early and mid 1969. And frankly, the doorstep in 1970, where basically professional soccer, after having gone through all of that, as we'll talk about, almost being left for dead professionally. Our guest is Dennis Seese, and he is the author of the book called The Rebirth of Professional Soccer in America, The Strange Days of the United Soccer Association. It's actually a bit of a misnomer because the United Soccer Association, or USA, was one of the two leagues in 1967 that aimed to bring pro top-tier soccer to the U.S., the other being the National Professional Soccer League, or NPSL. That book and our conversation with Dennis Seese talks about that and much, much more, both leagues, as well as all the prelude and the aftermath in our conversation coming up in a couple of seconds with our friend Dennis Seese in just a couple of seconds. Let's see. Promotionally, we want to remind you that Audible is our longtime sponsor, and if you haven't tried the audiobook service for yourself from Audible, please do so. You will not be disappointed. audibletrial.com/goodseats. It's your place to try for free 1 month of the service and a free audiobook download of your choice from over 185 or so thousand titles to choose from in dozens of genres, some of which I can't even imagine exist, but they're there. Everything from fiction and nonfiction, all kinds of subsectors thereafter and thereof, whatever. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Get your free book, or your audiobook download. Get your free 1 month subscription trial of the service. And yes, you can cancel at any time. It's basically no risk. And we appreciate your doing so. Of course, also, we encourage you to go to sportshistorycollectibles.com and where you can get all kinds of fun memorabilia and programs and guides and stickers and buttons and pennants and you name it, from leagues and teams that are no longer with us, a few that still are in previous incarnations. It is a treasure trove. You will lose at least a number of minutes of your life by going to this site and just at least meandering and wandering through all the cool stuff that proprietor Dean Mitchell has found and has available for sale. But I guarantee you will find something that will pique your interest. And of course, if it does, at sportshistorycollectibles.com, all you need to do is enter the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout. And our little secret, you're going to get 15% off your purchase. So go early, go often to sportshistorycollectibles.com. Again, remember, write down, don't forget, tell your friends, GOODSEATS being the promo code for your 15% discount at checkout. Okay, let's get into soccer and the very intriguing and important times of the mid and late 1960s, the real birth of top-tier professional soccer in this country. And, of course, it wouldn't be the history of soccer in this country without a complete misread, misfire, and all kinds of shenanigans to undermine it in the process. And it's a fascinating story. Our conversation with Dennis Seese coming up. Please enjoy. We kind of opened up the Pandora's box with an early episode we had in the spring of last year with Paul Gardner, the esteemed soccer journalist who's been around, frankly, since even the years prior to the birth, I guess, or the rebirth of Major League Division I professional soccer in this country. But before we get to all of that, how about a little bit of background about you as an individual, you as a professional, and how you stumbled across this topic, esoteric as it might seem to some of our audience, in the first place?
Sure. I'm born in Western Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. So American, gridiron football was and still is the biggest game in town there. So soccer, people started playing it when I was a kid, and I remember the first time I saw someone like, I'm coming back from soccer practice, and we were like, they might as well have been aliens. This would have been like the early 1980s. So I knew it existed, but it wasn't a big thing in my life until I was working at the University of Pittsburgh around 2006 when the World Cup was going on. And at that point in time, I was in charge of hiring graduate assistants in the library. And I'd hired, I just didn't do it on purpose, but I had a very international team of students working. I had students from Turkey and Russia and, so on and so forth. So when the World Cup was on, it was a big deal to us. We had like these streams going on in this little mailroom where we would hang out and things like that. And, someone told me Thierry Henry caught my eye, and someone said, well, hey, he plays for Arsenal. And I said, okay. So I started following Arsenal, and I've really been into club football ever since then. I still am one of those suffering human beings known as an Arsenal fan. And what really led me to this is around 2010, a friend and I, who had also really gotten into club football, the Premier League in particular, we decided to write a blog about football in England, but also in Spain. And we called it, the conceit was, oh, look at these silly Americans who don't know anything about this game. And we called it, we don't know it as football. And I started writing a lot about soccer and learning a lot about it, via that process. And one day, in 2011, I believe it was, in the spring, Manchester City played Stoke City in the semifinals of the FA Cup that year. And I wanted to write a post. I knew that Stoke was one of the oldest club teams, so I wanted to write a post about Stoke's history. And I stumbled upon a reference to the Cleveland Stokers. And that was the moment where this whole sort of Pandora's box opened right in front of me. And I found out, from, the reference to the name, and then I found out that Gordon Banks, who had, heroically been the keeper for the 1966 World Cup winning team, was on this Stoke City team who became the Cleveland Stokers. And I just couldn't fathom, being from Western Pennsylvania and just knowing all the history of Cleveland Municipal Stadium, I just couldn't fathom these men running around there in the summer of 1967 on that pitch. So I just started digging. And I hope that wasn't too long-winded, but that sort of led me into all of this.
No, that's great. And I was just a mere toddler in 67, not even, but just knowing what I know of the old Cleveland Municipal Stadium and Cleveland in general, you got to wonder how many people were rattling around, and it did indeed open up a Pandora's box, I'm sure. So what then convinced you to perhaps, I guess, pursue this as a project, and how did you determine that a book was the best form for such, et cetera?
Well, I didn't know that it would ever become a book. It was just something, and you had mentioned, you had asked me about my background. What I do for a living is I am a research and instruction librarian. Right now I work with high school students, but a lot of what's on my resume and a lot of what I was doing, especially at that time, was working in universities. I was working at American University when I made this discovery about the Cleveland Stokers. So I started going back into their newspaper files. I just thought it was fascinating. I thought it was fun. It was a fun way to kill time. And I started with the Stokers, and I noticed that the next year, 1968, Santos had done their summer tour in America, which they were wont to do, and they played the Cleveland Stokers, and they lost. They lost 2-1 on, I believe it's 2-1. It was 2-1, and there was a near riot in the stands. There was a poor call on a disallowed goal, apparently, according to Santos, and that just blew my mind all over again. Not only did this team exist, but here's another legend traipsing through Cleveland, playing a game. And not only did he play a game, they lost. That was one of Santos', I think they only lost one other match on that tour. And that was a year, I guess that was when, obviously that was near Pele's peak. And just on the club level, they were nearly unstoppable. And it was just, again, amazing. How did this happen? How come, does anyone know about this? And so it just, the professional part of me that likes to dig and that's interested in research, they just really went hand in hand. So once I started making these discoveries, then I learned about, at that point in time, the Wolverhampton Wanderers were still in the Premier League. So then I found out that they became the Los Angeles Wolves, and it just snowballed from there. And what really kicked it off into like the next level is I had cobbled together some information, and there was a really fantastic blog that I'm sad to say I haven't kept up with over the past year or so, and I think it might be shutting down, but it's called In Bed with Maradona. And they were very much into sort of the hidden histories of world soccer and soccer culture. You know, they weren't interested in transfer rumors. They wanted like stories from like the nooks and crannies of the history of the sport. And so I pitched the idea to them, and they said, yes, you know, write something up. So I wrote something up that was probably somewhere around 2,000, maybe 3,000 words at the most, just summing up the United Soccer Association, which is the league, you know, well, I'm sure we'll get to that the Stokers initially played for, and the Wolves. And I wrote that up, and I sent it to them, and they reacted like really incredibly well to it. You know, I was a struggling writer at that time. I mean, I still am. So it was great to just even get affirmation, and they ran it on the blog, and that was a huge deal to me because I read the blog, and so they put it out there for me, and that was like a huge victory for me at the time. So that was the first impetus. But even then, I never thought that it would be a book.
But you did commit to writing as part of your research efforts, right? At what point did you sort of recognize that that form factor-wise, that the book was the best way? I mean, I suspect that in your research, you probably also discovered, maybe not a whole lot, but video snippets and maybe some audio and some other sort of media, so to speak, in the mix. When did you sort of make the determination that publishing this thing for others to read would be desirable?
Well, I was on again, it was weird. I was on a mailing list. I was working at American University, and at that point in time, I had a chance to perhaps get tenure. Librarians there are tenured. And okay, I thought it'd be great to publish something. And there was a conference about, the social history of sport and sport history and things like that. As part of the Popular Culture Association of America, they had a track about sports history. So I submitted essentially the first couple of paragraphs of that post as an abstract for a paper, and it was accepted. So I presented what I had learned to that point about the United Soccer Association as a paper at this conference. Now, a woman named Christine Karnicki, who I found out later played semi-professional soccer as a woman here in the United States, she was an editor and is an editor at Rowman and Littlefield. And then it was Scarecrow Press, but they've sort of been folded into the Rowman and Littlefield family at large. She emailed me. She had seen the abstract, and she said, I'm really interested in this. Could we meet? And I fell out of my chair. This was like a dream come true, a publisher contacting me. So I was very nervously said, sure, I'd love to meet you. And she met, and she said, her brief was to get more books about soccer. The editors above her felt that it was something that was really starting to pick up traction historically and currently in America. And she asked me, do you think there's a book here? And other people had told me they thought there was a book there. But at the time, deep down in my heart of hearts, I did not know if there was. But of course, to her, I said, yeah, sure. Yeah, there's a book here. Definitely. So she said, submit a proposal. And I did. And it was accepted in the summer of 2013. And that started my journey of really sort of next level research.
All right, well, let's get into that journey. So obviously you want to begin at the beginning, right? So what are the seeds of this, right? Because the Wolves and the Stokers, or the Stoke City, they didn't just show up magically in 1967 with just intent, right? There are obviously seeds of why these two, or actually three to begin with, right? Professional organizations coalesced in the year of 1967 to actually give a shot in the arm to professional soccer in this country. But maybe you want to take our audience back to sort of some of the seeds of what the prelude was to this somewhat bizarre and astonishing a series of events in 1967, seemingly out of nowhere.
Yeah, sure. I would say from what I can tell is the real impetus for this sort of, as you say, bizarre sort of outburst in 1967 was I would trace back to 1960 with a gentleman named he was known as Bill, but William D. Cox, and I'm sure he is someone who you could do a few different podcasts on, because he's just a really interesting sort of shadowy figure in the periphery of American sports. He had owned the Philadelphia Phillies briefly. in the early 40s, and he ran afoul of Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, accusations of gambling and things like that. So he was drummed out of Major League Baseball and is still one of the few people who was ever sort of banned from baseball for life. So he was a wealthy sort of, well-to-do man, Yale baseball player. So he, obviously undaunted, pursued some other things from 1943 until around 1959. He decided, and all of these things started happening at once. Men like him, like sort of international, well-to-do Americans, started, with the advent of commercial air travel and things like that, it started to become very global for men of means. And they started to travel and notice, what is there 100,000 people in this stadium in Rio? Why is this AC Milan thing? Why are there people jammed to the rafters, 50,000 people in this stadium? And they started to notice that this is a big thing. Like it hasn't really touched our country to this level yet in terms of like commerce, but this is something worldwide that we should probably be taking a look at and could probably make money off of. Now, what made him unique is that he actually was a fan of the game. So what he started in 1960 in New York City was he called the International Soccer League. And one of his beliefs was that Americans didn't take to the game as folks did in other places around the globe because they hadn't seen it played at the highest level. They didn't get regular exposure to the Real Madrids and AC Milans and whoever, the Manchester Uniteds. So if he could showcase the top qualities from around Europe and South America, and then eventually somehow sort of knit an American team together on the fly, that then he could prove that soccer could really succeed commercially and economically in the United States. So he started this league called the International Soccer League in 1960, and they started a tournament, and they had teams from the areas I just mentioned, South America and Europe, come over and play a tournament in New York City. And that first initial tournament was won by, and I'm going to probably pronounce their name wrong, but a team in Brazil called Bangu. Bangu, and as far as I know, and as much as research I've done on, I'm by no means an expert on Brazilian soccer. They still seem to me relatively obscure, but at this time, in the 1960s, they were a regional powerhouse. So they were brought over, and they ended up winning this tournament. And it was set up, there was like a Group A and a Group B. And then the finals of the tournament consisted of the winners of each group. And they played Kilmarnock from Scotland, who would eventually later on figure into what would happen in the later 1960s. So every year, this tournament sort of grew a little bit bigger. I think by 1964, it was on CBS. I know locally, or maybe in the metro region, the 1960 finals, I believe, were broadcast. But by the 64, it was getting some exposure on CBS. And then 1960, and I think that year, I want to say they drew over 1 million people in 1964. And in 1965, they tried to expand it to other cities. They were looking at Montreal, but it had outgrown New York somewhat. And then all of a sudden, they were financially insolvent. I think they grew a little bit bigger than they had the means for at the time. So that takes us right up almost to 1967. This league sort of faltered in 1965. And the man behind it, as we were talking about, William D. Cox, he was not done yet. He decided to speak with other American businessmen, moguls, who in many cases, almost all cases, owned professional football or professional baseball franchises. So they started talking about how can we develop a professional top-flight American soccer league, and that sort of was the bridge to it.
Yeah. So before we get there, let's. There are a couple of things I want to sort of point to in the ISL, the International Soccer League. Right. You mentioned Bill Cox, obviously one of the only people still. Obviously, he's been long gone now for some time, but banned from baseball. He was caught basically betting on his Philadelphia Phillies franchise after he had fired his manager. And the manager then sort of turned around and accused him of betting, and that's but an odd sort of soul to be sort of the in some respects patron saint of the early days of reinvention of professional soccer. I urge our listeners to, if you haven't listened to it, to go to and find our episode number 6 back from April of 2017 with Paul Gardner, who gives us a couple of interesting little anecdotes about Mr. Cox, about the ISL, about sort of the early days and sort of the uniquenesses of this. It's my understanding, though, that like you sort of hinted at, that most of this was largely New York City centric, at least in the first couple of years, and in particular the perhaps quickly falling apart Polo Grounds.
Yes. Yes, I believe the Polo Grounds was used the first year. I know Roosevelt Stadium, and I believe that's the one on Randall Island, I believe. But yes, the Polo Grounds, Roosevelt Stadium, it was definitely based in initially and mostly based in New York City. That was where Cox was based. But when the foreign teams would come over, and we'll talk more about this, when the foreign teams would come over, like for example, AC Milan would come over to New York in that era, even if they weren't playing in the ISL, and they would draw like 25,000 people to one of those to a stadium like that. So New York was still, because there was still, there were so many sort of second generation Americans, what they were calling then hyphenated Americans, who still were close to the game. And these big internationally known teams were draws in New York City. They were huge draws. So that was one reason why it was there. And just to talk about him really quickly, I interviewed a man from my book named Derek Liechty. And he was the general manager of the Oakland/California Clippers. And he knew Mr. Cox very well. At the time this was going on, he was sort of like he had very few people helping him run the ISL, but Mr. Liechty was one of them. And even from someone who knew Mr. Cox, he still remains, to me, a very sort of shadowy, ghost-like figure, and one of the things that Mr. Liechty said when I interviewed him and when I met with him and spoke with him is that he was very much a loner and he was very sort of confrontational. The fact that I think people were telling him you can't own the Phillies just made him push that much harder, and you can't start a soccer league in America. That's ridiculous. That'll never work. He pushed and pushed. So he definitely seems like a fascinating man, which I wish I could do more research on. Sorry, I don't want to get too far off track.
No, I think it's great. I agree, and I think and there are some interesting little things that are still out there that I don't think have been really discovered. So, for example, I was able to, in my little research in 1962, at least, I saw somebody posted years ago an image from what was apparently the entire tournament being covered on local television in New York, WPIX TV, currently now owned by Tribune Media. You wonder in the vaults there if some of those games are available. You mentioned in 1964, CBS indeed broadcast apparently parts or a part of the Cup final, and it's my understanding that Jack Whitaker, well-known and legendary broadcaster for CBS Sports over the years, who actually was part of the announcing team when we'll talk about in a few minutes in the years to come when the leagues were getting started professionally again, and is actually still with us. He's actually somebody I'm trying to pursue for a conversation. I hear he's quite lucid and very gregarious in conversation. And talk about wow. CBS, right? They're CBS was, as we'll talk about, was instrumental in the early part of televising this sport in '67 and '68. But I'll be damned if anybody can find any video from that. And you got to think people like Jack Whitaker and maybe a few others might have some idea, maybe where a shard or two of that video might actually exist.
Yeah, that would be incredible. I do hope you get to speak with him. I feel like, I don't know who has it or what, but every now and then I feel like little dribs and drabs of it appear on YouTube sort of mysteriously. Like you could see a little bit of the 1967 United Soccer Association final match between the Wolves and the Washington Whips, for example, and there's a tiny bit of footage of the Oakland Clippers playing the Dynamo Kiev, and things like that. But the ISL matches, and I appreciate you sending me a link in preparation for this. I hadn't seen that before, so that would be fantastic if that stuff would ever come to light, if it exists.
Well, let's get to 1965 because it's kind of a crucial sort of setup, because it also is a bit of a hint too, because while the financial issues and obviously Cox was not able to sort of I guess, continue with this concept. Obviously, his interest in professional soccer as a thing in the United States was not lost, right? He was still very much interested, but is also the beginnings of what would become a much more pronounced confrontation, shall we say, with this thing called the United States Soccer Football Association, what is now kind of known as the United States Soccer Federation. But for those who are sort of uncertain or unknowledgeable about the sport of soccer, it is essentially the United States' official representation of oversight for the sport of soccer in relation to the international governing body called FIFA. Do you mind me want to talk about a couple of little nits that were starting to begin there as Cox was trying to take this tournament to the next level, and maybe was what you call rebuffed by the governing body here in the States?
I would say rebuffed that's it. That you could depict it as that, and again, I feel like it just comes down to he was sort of tarred with this, by being banned from baseball. I think he was viewed very skeptically, and as I said, people that know him said he was sort of he was confrontational in some ways. So I think he was always ready for a battle. And what I found underlying everything, almost everything in these sort of battles was the rights to have foreign teams come and play in the United States, because in this era, that was where the money was. That was the draw. To be able to have Santos come in or AC Milan or whoever it was, that was where money was to be made. And I think that he just did not want to deal with them, because essentially what they would do is, and they were a very small organization, and if you look throughout their history, again, that can be a whole nother podcast, the leadership has often been characterized as sort of short-sighted and poor from this organization. And you can trace back at parts in their history and sort of see these patterns of poor decision-making and, frankly, incompetence. And I think what was probably going on is that they wanted more, and they wanted probably more and more percentage of the gate, or sort of I'm trying to think of what you would term the fee to let Cox keep bringing these teams over. They basically, for FIFA to be okay with it, they would have to lend their imprimatur, they would have to lend their emblem to it. And I think he and they probably just got tired of dealing with each other. And I'm sure money was involved there. So I think he was probably trying to circumvent them at his earliest possible at every sort of juncture to probably try and get around them. And that's the other thing, too, that you'll see running through this story. So we have this body that runs soccer in the United States, ostensibly, but it reports to FIFA. And then, as we'll see a little bit later on in this story, all these powerful men who own NFL teams and Major League Baseball teams, the fact that they couldn't just do whatever it is that they wanted to do, but they had, the fact that they couldn't do that they had to run it first by some international organization, that was something that hardly any of them had ever experienced before. So it was a different sort of bureaucracy on many levels that was at play here.
All right, let's forward to 66, right? Because that seems to be where a lot of the action sort of occurred. So Cox is, while he's suing the United States Soccer Football Association for antitrust, which apparently he ultimately won, but it was too late to sort of save the ISL from continuing its own thing. He was well on his way to working on figuring out a more professional league approach for the United States. Yes. He and his colleague, also another sort of unsung early supporter of the sport in this country, Bob Herman, announced teams for a league, but in May of 1966. But you wonder if, surprised, they were not the only ones with the same idea, were they?
They were not. There was a competing sort of, well, that's the other thing. I would love to have been able to interview someone that was at this meeting. But apparently all of these powerful men sat down and they were all on the same page at one point in time. And the Bidwell family, who owned the Arizona and St. Louis Cardinals, they were in the picture, and the Allens, who had owned the Chicago White Sox, and even the Rooneys, who owned the Steelers, and people who eventually stayed in the story, like Lamar Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs and Jack Kent Cooke. These people ended up staying within this narrative, but all these powerful men sat down with Cox and with Herman, and I think they were all on the same page initially, but I don't know. It's not clear whether it's ego or difference of opinion, but these sort of groups splinter. And one of them, Cox and Herman, sort of end up on one side, and Jack Kent Cooke and Lamar Hunt and these people end up on the other side. And you're right, this meeting, you can trace this back to May of 1966, and that was one of the other things that I found in my book and within doing research is everyone points to the World Cup final in 1966 as being the thing that sprung all of this into motion. But as you can see, it's documented. It was in motion before that happened. The fact that that happened and drew such a great rating on NBC in the United States, that just added fuel to a fire that was already sort of smoldering. And that was one, I feel like, sort of preconception that I hope that anyone who reads my book understands that's not really the whole story. That's sort of like just taken as a fact that, oh, yeah, the World Cup final in 1966, that made these guys jump into action. They were already eyeing this sport before then.
Yeah,
so what happens is...
That is interesting because that final was broadcast on NBC, and Jim Simpson, another sort of legendary, mostly pro football announcer, was the guy who basically voiced that, and apparently quite well based on the research that I was able to tell. And it was basically the entire game, but it was a couple of hours delayed. Obviously, the most well-attended and successful World Cup until 1994 in England. But you're right, and I guess my question is, before you even go further, is from what you can determine, why do you think? I mean, was it an understanding that this thing would be big? And make a powerful sort of televised sort of statement in the later part of the year, or were there other things in motion to? I mean, look, in essence, I think it's important to remember if you're going from zero or maybe half of a professional organization of soccer, that is the American Soccer League, which has had its own sort of torturous history in terms of amateurism versus professionalism and ethnicities and all those kinds of things, but. You know, the governing body in the United States was like, I think only 2 people as a professional office, right? And all of a sudden,
yes,
you have 3 competing groups of very rich and successful business folk in the United States circling around this sport that arguably was more of an ethnic curiosity until that time professionally. I'm just wondering what prior to the World Cup was putting all this stuff so dramatically in motion in your mind?
Well, from what I can tell, I think 2 things. As I mentioned a few different times, as far back as 1948, big-time club teams started touring the United States and were always successful. Liverpool did a tour in 1948, and I think that's probably the first one, we'll say, of the post-war era that really drew well. And then every year, more and more teams would come over and play matches that drew incredibly well. So they had it right in front of them. Okay, people will pay to see this. We know that. And we also know from being, international businessmen that wherever we go outside of this country, this game is massive. People love it. People will line up around the block to come in a stadium and watch this. So we know something's here. We know how to market things. This is just another thing. So as soon as we get it running, boom, it's going to be just like basketball or hockey or whatever, sort of like the next sort of on the second tier of American sport. And that was the other thing. They had just, in the 60s, at this time, they were just expanding Major League Baseball to the West Coast. They had just got the Los Angeles Lakers, for the National Basketball Association. There was expansion in the National Hockey League. So they were basically sort of maxed out. They had run out of, literally run out of, landmass in America and run out of sports. But cable TV was starting to be a big revenue stream. So they wanted to keep adding to that revenue stream and keep tapping into it. So the soccer was just the next logical thing. And I think that was what was behind it. Like, we can plug this in and make more money, and then we'll worry about what's next after we get this, going. I really think there was some of that in there. They knew it was big, and that's all they knew. And I feel like they figured, hey, we know how to do this. We know how to market things. We know how to get people to come to things. So once we apply that knowledge to what's something that's already big, we'll just snap our fingers and go to the bank.
Yeah, and that's a theme that Paul Gardner returned to on a number of occasions, and I think it's actually something that has bedeviled the sport even to this day in the United States, is the quote-unquote business people versus the quote-unquote soccer people. Frankly, the most visceral expression of that right now, as we record this in late January of 2018, the battle for who will be the next president and overseer of the United States Soccer Federation, U.S. Soccer. And it is very much, what is it about money, and is it about, and or is it about the quality and the sanctity of the sport, and how those sort of mutually sort of coexist. But, as we segue, so 1966, right? So that final surprises, I think, a lot of people, certainly in the television world. It certainly adds that fuel to the fire and bolsters what these three now groups of businessmen sort of recognize is perhaps lightning in a bottle. Maybe you can sort of walk through the latter part of 66 and early 67, because clearly three professional leagues when there really weren't any the year before doesn't seem like something that's going to immediately fly here in this country, despite the best intentions of many successful businessmen.
No, you're right, and just two quick data points here from what I was able to uncover in my research. The United States Soccer Federation, like you had mentioned, they had, I think it was 2 or 3 people on staff. I've heard both, but their operating budget at that time, the entire organization's, was $75,000 around this era. So we'll start talking about money soon, probably, but that just gives you a sense of how small this organization was. And then the figure I got from the World Cup ratings on NBC, the 1966 World Cup final ratings, were that they had around 10 million viewers. So as we talked about, this thing was already in motion, but once that figure came out, these men really sort of hit the accelerator and said, all right, we're going to go. We're going to do this, and this is going to be big. We'll figure out the specifics later. Because that's the one thing, as I would mention, and I touched on it earlier, Cox actually apparently was a fan of the game. He at least understood it a little bit, whereas I don't think many, if any, of these other men, and you'll see by some of their decision-making later, understood the game at all. It was just something that they were going to market, and that's what they knew how to do, and they were going to do it, and then boom. So as 66 winds down, the groups are pretty much, the third group I did as much research as I could on, and they remain they kind of are lost to history. There's a couple different theories of who that group might have been, but it really solidifies into 2 groups, the one led by Cox and Herman, which eventually would become the National Professional Soccer League, NPSL, and then Lamar Hunt, Jack Kent Cooke, and others who would become the United Soccer Association. But at that time, they were known as the North American Soccer League, the NASL, which would later on, once these leagues merged, eventually, the NASL would live on to 1984. So these 2 entrenched groups are there, and as I just mentioned, this very small, tiny, cash-starved organization, the United States Soccer Football Association, they basically, and as you had mentioned, I think you had mentioned, or you had sent to me in our email communication, at this time, FIFA was headed by a man named Rouse, and he had gotten wind of this, and he basically was like, in so many words, like, you guys are crazy. There's no way you can. Chances are you probably can't even make one domestic league float right now. There's no way on God's green earth you can make 2. So figure something out, have one league, we'll support you, give it a try. So that advice was ignored. And what the United States Federation did was to step in and say, all right, submit a bid. And we'll go with submit a bid and tell us how you can market the sport. And, there's basically like a buy-in fee, and we'll give you we'll give the winner the right to do this. And that bid was awarded to the North American Soccer League, soon to become the United Soccer Association. And people, there's evidence that supports that there might have been a little bit of under the table stuff going on there, because people associated with the United States Soccer Football Association were, all of a sudden had different jobs within this new league, and things like that. So, and the other league cried foul and said, that this isn't fair. The group with Cox and Herman, they were eventually not given the bid for legitimacy. And that really set the stage for sort of an acrimonious battle, which it was. And then the trump card was that they then went and got a television contract. And I think it was right around in November of 1966. They were able to sort of one-up the NASL. The NASL was basically given a sanction to operate as the, sanctioned professional soccer league in the United States beginning in 1968, actually, initially. But the NPSL was then able to go to CBS and get a television contract to start in the spring of 1967. So there we have two leagues there, that should have been a whole. But we have one that's sanctioned, one that's not sanctioned and labeled rogue, a word that comes up in this narrative throughout the United States soccer history. But they're the ones that people can turn on their televisions and see. So when I discovered that fact initially, too, I was almost more blown away than I was to find out that Gordon Banks was playing in Municipal Bank Stadium in Cleveland in 1967. I mean, there's just so many parts of this story that are just so bizarre and hard to believe.
Well, it's interesting. It seems to me almost that because Cox understood from his years of running and importing full-fledged international soccer teams and the tournament that he ran in the ISL, it almost feels like he had a little bit of an edge in terms of at least understanding some of the issues and the intricacies of the sport. So in essence, what you're describing, I think it's actually important to actually step back for a second because however the United States Soccer Football Association got hip, they certainly did, actually, having gone from that sort of small, paltry operating budget. I mean, I think it's important to remember that the American Soccer League, again, that sort of quasi-professional and long-standing league in this country, was essentially the only professional kind of expression in the United States. They were only paying $25, right? Not $1,000, but $25 a year for its official sanction as being the pro league in the United States. And then, in 1966,
that's correct.
Because of all this interest, the Federation basically said, okay, there's opportunity here. If all these entities and all these very rich and powerful businessmen are coming to us, it's my understanding that they basically put some contractual things on the table in order to win or to award that official sanction, including wanting 4% of the gate receipts of all the games, 10% of all the television money, and a franchise fee. I think it was around $25K for each team. And I think the reaction was Cox and his group kind of balked at it, right? But they
did.
Right, but Jack and Cook's group kind of said, all right, well, if that's what it's going to take, it's a small price to pay. And then, it seems like that Cox and his group kind of countered with, all right, well, you're going to announce for 68. We'll have our television deal and we're going to start in 67. So it seems very tit for tat. And it's just interesting how all these things come together and sort of make this story incredible as it might be, where two professional leagues are going to compete with each other. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
It is hard to believe, and you're exactly right. And you had mentioned about the ASL fee of being $25 a year, and then now all of a sudden you're talking about $250,000. Because when it was all said and done, what you just said was exactly right. There was like a base fee for franchise, and then all these other things, that it was roughly around $250,000 each of these men had to pay to. Oh wait, excuse me, that was the wrong fee. I'm sorry. I'm trying to have the exact numbers in front of me. That was the fee to import the actual teams, which we'll get to in a moment. But yes, it went up. The money went up exponentially. It went from $25 to license ASL games to $25,000 plus 5% of television revenue, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you're right. And the men of the NPSL balked at that and said, no way, we're not going to do that. So it was easy to award the sanction to the other group. And then also, you're right that they knew that they could trump them with two ways. Number one, the television was the big trump card. And from what I understood, from what I've been able to uncover, the NASL/USA were offered a similar contract from CBS, but CBS had language in it that they would only do one match a week, and it was on their terms or this or that. And it was probably sour grapes, but the United Soccer Association men were on record later saying, "Oh, that TV contract is garbage, and we're going to get rid of that. We didn't want it. We turned it down." But meanwhile, they were all seething inside. I mean, it was actually very well played. You're right. It was tit for tat, chess, however way you want to say it. But the NPSL, not only did it get the contract, but it said, "Well, all right, yeah, we're going to be ready to play in the spring." And then those men went out and started actually putting teams together. So then all of a sudden, the United Soccer Association and the NASL, they hadn't planned to start until 1968, so they had no teams, they had no anything. So then they had to decide, okay, we can't let this other team, we can't let this other league start play a year ahead of us and be on TV. We'll be dead in the water. So that was the idea then, which it was kind of like Cox's idea. Well, all right, we'll just bring a foreign team over, but we'll slap a local name on them. And that was the other fascinating part. And that's like one of the things that I talk about a lot in my book is just sort of this weird play of identity. The fact that the Washington Whips were actually the Aberdeen Dons. You know, like that whole kind of thing is so weird. And there is evidence that they tried to match these teams ethnically by city. Like Boston got the team from Ireland. They got the Shamrock Rovers, and because there were so many Italian Americans in Chicago, they got Cagliari Calcio, and so on and so forth. Some of the connections aren't really easy to discern, but some were, and like they were actually thinking about that. So that adds another level of sort of how does identity play into this? And but you're right. It was a very brilliant move to get the television contract first.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats. For your free 1-month trial of the Audible service and, most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Boehmer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. Well, so when the dust settles, we're looking at early 1967 for admittedly rushed launches of these 2 competing entities. One now called the NPSL with a contract in hand, but labeled as rogue by FIFA and the U.S. Federation.
Yes.
And the newly renamed United Soccer Association, which has the official charter from FIFA and the Federation in the United States, yet has now had their timetable been moved up by a year So maybe you can describe sort of the frenetic moments of trying to get 2 professional leagues off the ground in 1967 from a very cold and minimal start. Maybe you can sort of walk our audience through sort of those weeks and months and perhaps how they initially came to market with their first games in 1967.
Yeah, and again, you'll see too the evidence that the FIFA sanction was important for many reasons, but it was mostly important to be able to bring in other international teams, because one of the first things that the United Soccer Association did with their sanction was to arrange a series of like 4 or 5 exhibition matches to get people in their biggest cities excited about this new league that was going to play there. So, for example, Liverpool played in Los Angeles. Real Madrid played West Ham United in the Astrodome. Athletic Bilbao played Red Star Belgrade in Comiskey Park. So that right away, that was a revenue stream that they were going to hit right away, and they did, which shows its importance. So what happened in October, once the late October, early November, once the NPSL was awarded the television contract, all of those people went into overdrive assembling actual teams. And they were a mix of sort of probably semi-pros, pros from Europe who, were probably at the end of their careers, players from under-scouted at that time areas like, Central America, the islands, places like that. Probably the Baltimore Bays, since I had access to the Baltimore Sun's archive, and I use them as the examples, I use them to sort of tell the story of the NPSL in my book. You can see the sort of painstaking work that Gordon Diego and people like this put into finding players. They were finding players all over the world. They were able to find players from Israel. They were able to find players from Jamaica. They really set about building teams. It was really interesting. The United States Soccer Association, it was nothing I could imagine. It was basically just cold panic. Like, what are we going to do? There's no way we're going to be able to put teams together. Even though the men on the other side were able to do a half decent job of cobbling these teams together. The United States Soccer Association just said, all right, well, you know what? We'll just import teams to sort of we'll import teams. We'll have them play under the franchise names that we're going to trot out there. And then we'll build the teams behind the scenes while these teams play for this first summer. So there was definitely some panic, but once they figured that out, I think they probably felt like pretty assured, that it was going to work out. They got some pretty good teams. They got a bunch of teams from England. They got Sunderland. They got Stoke. They got Wolves. They got a bunch of teams from Scotland. Scotland's league at that point in time was really powerful. As a matter of fact, Celtic had just won they were the first team from the UK to win the European Championship, now the Champions League trophy, which when I discovered that, I was amazed. I had no idea they were the first team to win it. They had, from the United Kingdom, they had won it before Manchester United or anybody else. So they picked 2 or 3 different teams from that league, like Aberdeen and Hibernian. So these teams were playing. They were sparring with European champions. So, these are some, pretty well-known teams. And then they got teams from South America. So I think there was definitely some panic until they figured out, who they could get, when, and the logistics and all that stuff. So I'm sure it was a white-hot race to the finish for those guys, whereas the other people seemed to be a little bit more business-like. The NPSL, they were really better at, like, okay, let's build this from the ground up. And in a way, they seem to have a little bit more of the bigger picture in mind. And I feel like fate just sort of threw this curveball at the United Soccer Association, and they were lucky enough to get the teams that they were able to get to come over and then play this schedule. Do you think the NPSL was hampered by the fact that they were essentially a rogue league? Obviously they were sort of stymied by the fact that they didn't have that, but obviously that has an implication, especially for folks who don't understand sort of world soccer, right? Because by being brandished now an outlaw league, that actually can very seriously prevent perhaps quality players from joining that league for fear of being blackballed in their desire to go to other leagues and other teams worldwide under FIFA control.
It seems like they settled for younger, unproven players and maybe older players who didn't have much sort of transfer value going forward. But you got to think it did stymie a bit of at least getting some quality players into the NPSL so quickly.
Oh, it definitely did. That's a great point. It definitely did. There was I found a UPI article quoting the one of the heads of the football association in England threatening players not to play for the rogue, not to play, that there'd be punitive actions taken if people went over and played. So Phil Woosnam talked about that actually. He was sort of at the end of his career, so I don't think he cared. But yeah, it definitely impacted players from England for sure, because they were sort of given some chin music like right off the bat, like don't do this or you'll be punished. So the only people willing to sort of try their luck, I think, were people who probably didn't have much of a future there anyway, that were sort of marginal talents, or people like Woosnam that had played already for Aston Villa and all of these teams and were sort of at the end of their careers. So yeah, that's definitely a great point. And when you look at the rosters of some of these NPSL teams, a lot of them are like, players from the developing world who I don't know what the scouting pipelines were at that time from some of the bigger European clubs, but it seemed like not only were they from the developing world, but they were from places that really weren't, talent, they weren't established pipelines for talent at the time. And then there were men from like South America or, elsewhere in Europe who were sort of at the end of their careers, and they just wanted to keep playing and they had nothing to lose and they weren't worried about, being labeled rogue. But that definitely figured into it for sure.
But the NPSL was the first one really to come out of the gates, right? Their season started in April of '67. Obviously, the first televised broadcast on CBS nationwide. Maybe you want to give our audience a bit of a sense of how the NPSL sort of came onto the scene and what their initial few weeks and months were before the USA even got their chance to debut.
Yeah, sure. Their first match was, I want to say, I don't have it right in front of me. I want to say it was definitely in early April. I want to say like around April 7th, somewhere around there.
April 16th, 1967, the Atlanta Chiefs and the Baltimore Bays in Baltimore at the old Memorial Stadium.
Yes, it was at the old Memorial Stadium, and it was a huge production. Apparently, they had the most state-of-the-art television production, and that was interesting. I found material that basically CBS wanted to Americanize the product as much as they could. So they were going to show it from different angles, and they were going to, there was going to be more breaks in the action so they can jam in commercials, but they were, and we'll probably talk about that. They had a way that they were going to sort of insert more breaks into the play, but apparently the production was state of the art. And I want to say that match ended 1-0, I believe. To the Bays. Again, I don't have that in front of me, but they,
Baltimore won it.
Yep. That's where we at. And I guess it got decent ratings, but CBS's thing was, and I think this is one of the things that, the United Soccer Association folks balked at. I guess they wanted maybe 2 games a week or whatever, but CBS was only willing to give 1 game a week. And it was sort of like a showcase. So then, one of the next games, featured, this, I don't know if you want me to jump ahead to that, but one of the next games really featured something in a way nefarious. As I'd mentioned, there's newspaper clippings and research that I've encountered that CBS really sort of wanted to make this product as palatable as possible for Americans. So we had state-of-the-art television setups in the stadium, and there were going to be ways that they can have the referees sort of slow play down so that they can add in commercials, because people don't know things like the 2-minute warning in the NFL and the National Football League. That was inserted just to have commercials. It was never a feature of the game. It's not a necessary feature of the game. So keep with that in mind. They were trying to find ways for the referees to sort of add unnatural stoppages to the flow of a soccer match, which we all know it just plays continuously. So one of the things that they would do is they literally had the referees wired up with these sort of like electronic boxes, and they would get signals from the production booth. I mean, the production booth was really calling the shots above all else, above the managers, above the referees, and they would sort of send the referees like a little message saying, okay, let's have how about a stoppage here? And a referee then might blow a whistle. If someone someone got tackled, they were a little bit slow to get up, they might blow a whistle, and then they would try and slide in a commercial. And this really got scary. It was either the second or third broadcast. So the United Soccer Association started on April 28th. So it wasn't like they had very much window to just sort of stake their claim. They probably had 2 or 3 nationally televised matches at most before their competition started. But their competition you weren't going to see unless you were in that city and you can pay to go see a ticket, or to pay for a ticket. So they only had a very short window. So they had that match, and then they had a match between Toronto and I believe the Pittsburgh franchise. And there was a referee in that match named Peter Rhodes who was trying to add in the sort of artificial breaks. And he admitted afterwards that this was the setup, and other people have admitted this too. But then the league came out right away and sort of said, no, that's not true. And it became this big controversy. It became like this really strange event in a series, in a summer full of strange events. So I don't think that they had a massive window to go back to your original question, to sort of show off their product before their competitors started. But apparently the broadcast was the best you could do at the time. But I think, again, this shows that the men behind it didn't know as much about soccer as they maybe could have or should have. Because I think they were trying to sort of alter it in certain ways that didn't work.
Yeah, so the note on Peter Rhodes, and that it does come out in, I think, a year later in some articles. In particular, I think there was an article in '68 in Sports Illustrated penned by the color commentator for those CBS broadcasts, Jack Whitaker doing the play-by-play, but a former player from Northern Ireland named Danny Blanchflower, who, according to all evidence that I've seen, was, shall we say, not shy about his calling it like he saw the quality of play, that is, not so high quality of play, on those broadcasts.
That's correct.
It doesn't seem like CBS appreciated his, shall we say, more than honest commentary. But, the quality of play was, as any early stage league with a quick assemblage of players that have never played with each other before, was not all that great, was it?
No, it wasn't, but it's funny that you say that, because, I mean, it wasn't. You weren't going to see West Ham, United, or flowing, Real Madrid attacking football. But statistically, there's this incredible book. It's out of print now, called the Encyclopedia of American Soccer, and it was published in 1980. And I was able to track a copy down while doing doing the research for my book. The scoring on average that year, in terms of like total goals and things like that, was on par with the English First Division and the German First Division. So it wasn't the same quality, but it's not like it was just all boredom. I mean, there were some talented players scattered throughout this league, and that's the other thing that's so fascinating about it. Like, for example, Dennis Violette, who was one of the Busby Babes, he was a Manchester United legend. He played for the Baltimore Bays. There was a legend from Barcelona, Ladislau. I'm going to totally butcher his last name, but he played for the Toronto franchise. I mean, it just there were gems sort of nestled in. Established gems sort of nestled in the NPSL, as well as people like Kaiser Moatang, who would become well-known figures throughout the game. So it really was a very strange mixed bag. I mean, I wouldn't call it awful, but it definitely wasn't, your top-notch first division football like in Europe. But there was more. It had more to offer than I think people initially thought.
Well, there's no doubt, too, that a number of those players from that initial assemblage wound up staying in the United States and becoming very seminal in the further growth of the sport in all its ups and downs. I mean, Phil Woosnam before, Ron Newman, who was a legendary not only player but coach and administrator who was playing for Atlanta. Gabo Gavric, Elijah Mitic in Oakland, Walt Chiszewicz, Willie Roy, Pat McBride. I mean, you have plenty of folks that would later go on to sort of keep this sport alive and then take it sort of to the next level. But I can't imagine, though, that the controversies that Blanche Flower in the later years would sort of kind of even bring more to the fore, the NPSL not necessarily getting off to a tremendous start when refereeing was questioned, shall we say, or some of the production shenanigans, right? It's kind of you say it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, the fact that CBS, right, nationally broadcasting games, I mean, that's like gold, right, to any fledgling professional league both then and now. Yet you can feel, and depending on your perspective, the artificiality, maybe because of the conventions of television, or perhaps because of the ignorance of businessmen and or TV producers who didn't understand and or appreciate the sport, that, kind of, for every step forward, there's a step back. And, when you're trying to nurture something that's relatively new to the American populace, these sort of hints of negativity probably didn't help the process. And I guess by extension, the USA, when they started a few weeks later as well. But maybe you can kind of get into the USA and its start in the midst of and despite the NPSL's interesting stumbles in the beginning.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I was just sort of defending the NPSL, but it's like no matter how talented the people were, they still had to cohere as a team. They had a very brief sort of window for training, so there was definitely going to be some growing pains. And that first match, I did as much research as I could on that from the Baltimore Sun and anywhere else I could. I mean, it was kind of the very first match that they put on TV that we just talked about, those 1-0, was kind of known as like a really sort of boring match. But that was like one of the weirdest, like, sort of ironies of this is that the fully formed teams that were in fighting fit were teams that you were not going to be able to see on TV. Like, you couldn't see teams from Scotland who were sparring with the world, the European champion Celtic. Like, you weren't going to be able to see teams from Italy. Cagliari, they've only won the Scudetto one time, and it was they brought this team over in '67. They won it in 1970. So I mean, that's what was just so crazy about it is if you're trying to get viewers, you're sort of showing you're stuck with the NPSL how it turned out. Sort of an unfinished product, a product that was sort of emerging, maybe not the best quality of play while these people figured out how to play with each other. Whereas here you have teams that just finished their domestic campaign in the United Soccer Association and that are very fit, very cohesive, very ready to play. And they're the teams that, are not on the air. So again, it's just one of the things that happened throughout this time. It's just like, wow, how did this happen? Why did it's so strange. But the United Soccer Association started around April 28th, and they had good crowds all around, and they had a massive crowd in the Astrodome to watch the Houston Stars. Great crowds all around. They would ultimately fizzle a little bit when the novelty wore off, but I feel like I would say they had a better start. And one of the interesting things about the United Soccer Association is that since they weren't on television, newspaper coverage in each city became paramount to sell tickets. I mean, newspaper coverage at that point in time in the late 60s was still basically the only game in town anyway. I mean, it was going to drive tickets whether television existed in a market or not, but it was absolutely paramount to help the United Soccer Association draw in the cities in which it was in. And I found a couple different things. It was always painted, the coverage of these teams throughout either city was always sort of painted in this really weird, negative, sort of sinister light. Like soccer, to a conservative sports writer, soccer was just this alien, really bizarre thing, and their language really bore that out. And the other thing that would happen is, since this was such a new thing, and it was something I think editors and newsrooms were saying no one's going to care about this anyway, so they were putting their youngest, most inexperienced reporters in the United Soccer Association's case for sure, but you see it in both leagues. But in the United Soccer Association, that was a bigger deal. And it's hilarious because these men eventually became like big deals. Like Andrew Bayer, for example, covered the Washington Whips for the Washington Post. And he was like 25 years old. He became like one of the foremost journalists covering horse racing in the United States, and still is. But it was just hilarious seeing him sort of at the beginning of his career, just kind of low person on the totem pole, assigned this, I guess probably at the time, not an enviable job of telling the world about the Washington Whips. And you see this sort of pattern play out in every city. But initially, I think they were placed really well, the teams and the cities, and people were excited for at least a couple weeks. And then I think the novelty wore off. Sadly, again, at the same time where the quality of play in that league was like really heating up and really, nice, something that, comparable to what you would see in Europe or South America.
It's interesting too. Did you, I don't know how much you got a sense of this, the two leagues, right? There were 4 cities, and actually, if you include metropolitan areas, 6 metropolitan areas that actually had a team in each of the leagues, right? So Toronto, New York, LA, and Chicago had teams in both leagues. And then by extension, the Baltimore, Washington area had a team in each league, as did the Bay Area, one in San Francisco and one in Oakland. Were you able to determine, and you may have written about this and I may have just missed it, who might have, was there a pattern to who was of those competing markets, who might have done better or fared better at the gate and or in the perception of the press that year?
I think definitely in terms of in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Golden Gales were a team from the Netherlands, ADO Den Haag, and they were at the time, they're pretty obscure now. They might even be in the second division, I believe, but they were very good at the time. So they were a good team. But the Oakland Clippers, I have a whole chapter in my book about them. I mean, they were really an interesting bunch of individuals, and their coach was this incredibly colorful man. He challenged, I think this is the only time that this happened, he challenged the San Francisco Golden Gales in the newspapers to play a match. And so I think the Clippers definitely did better box office wise in that market, and they had better success on the field because then they won the inaugural and only NPSL championship. So I think that's one market where you can say there was sort of a clear-cut victor. I think it's interesting, the market that I'm in right now, the DC metropolitan area, the Bays and the Whips were both very successful. I want to say probably very close to even in terms of attendance. There might have been a slight edge on the Washington Whips on their side, but both teams ended up losing their respective championship games. So it was kind of a stalemate in terms of on-field success. But my impression is the Whips might have drew just a tad bit more. The New York teams, it's really hard to tell. I don't think either of them drew very well. And Chicago, I think after a strong start, same thing. But I for some reason, I think the Mustangs, probably because of quality of play, they were the team from the Serie A, Cagliari. I would say they probably had a slight edge in terms. They definitely had a huge edge in quality, and I think they eventually had a slight edge in attendance. But attendance in Chicago overall that season was poor. The Chicago Wolves, they eventually became the Kansas City Wolves, so they weren't long for this world. So I definitely think the Mustangs had more to offer and drew more than they did in terms of in terms of the cities.
Yeah, the tally at the end of the season, though, right? So I don't think we kind of mentioned this, but and I'm not sure which league or if it was sort of an amalgam of both of the leagues, but there was a number that I had sort of found out there that going into 67, the sort of break-even attendance number was estimated to be around 12,000, and the NPSL, by comparison, I mean, neither league was, amazingly attended. You mentioned a couple of sort of the initial ones and some of the initial frenzy in the beginning and stuff, some sizable crowds. But when all the dust settled at the end of the season, right, the NPSL was below 5,000. I think it was like 4,879 was their league average, right? 4,879 people per game. And the USA was closer to 8,000 a game, right? 7,890, I think, was the number. Houston had, I think, 19,000, almost 20,000 on average, which is tremendous. So just by that metric alone, the USA would seem to have had perceived a better season, arguably better play, right? Because these were whole cloth teams. It also was a shorter season, so that maybe manufactured a bit more scarcity and a bit more maybe intrigue for each game versus a longer season. But it's interesting too. It seems like both playoffs for each of the leagues were quite interesting and quite exciting. There is some video out there of the 1967 USA final between the Wolves and Washington that is narrated by LA's own Chick Hearn. I don't think it's actually the game like a broadcast, but it's sort of a recreation or of such, almost like a film highlight thing. But it's tremendous out there. Definitely find it on YouTube. But it's really well done. You can see that the real energy there in the stadium in the LA Memorial Coliseum, only 17,000 or so there. But wow, it was fun. It was a 6-5 overtime game. And, it doesn't seem to me that some of these games were not exciting and that there was some real energy on the field across both of these leagues in 1967.
Oh, there definitely was. I mean, I spent a long time just pouring through, sort of at the real nitty-gritty of writing this. I spent a long time pouring through like match recaps and match, previews and things like that. And there were high points on the field, no doubt about it. I would say there were probably more in the United Soccer Association just because of like we've been talking about cohesive teams. But by the time the NPSL was winding down, there were probably 5 or 6 teams there that were also playing really well, that had really gelled together, and there was some real excitement at the end. I mean, the Baltimore Bays didn't clinch their spot in the championship game until right near the end. I mean, they were battling the Philadelphia squad. The Pittsburgh team was involved a little bit. I mean, there were a lot of teams that were sort of that were respectable towards the end of it. Yeah, and I have some of these numbers in front of me. You're right. The average attendance for the United Soccer Association was 7,890, which is, I mean, to start out with, that's not terrible. But they were playing in like these huge baseball and football stadiums. So if you ever see pictures, I mean, it looks like there's nobody in the stands at all in a lot of these games that I've seen. And then, as you said, there was almost 18,000 in the LA Coliseum to watch the finals. The crowd, the opening night crowd in Houston, they had almost 35,000 in the Astrodome. They had 34,965 to be specific. That's incredible. And that's why, I mean, crowds like that is what skewed their average up to almost 20,000 people. But I mean, again, that's not bad. I mean, if you would have asked the people if they would take that, I'm sure they would have taken that going into it. But yeah, this match here, I wish I could see a whole video of the final between the Wolves and the Whips. And as you said, it was 6-5. There were 2 hat tricks. And it ended as it should have throughout this whole story. It ended on an own goal, 36 minutes into extra time. I mean, there was a man who played for the Whips named Bobby Clark. He was the goaltender, and he was quoted in the Post after the match saying the World Cup final between England and Germany was not quite as good as this match. Like, it really ended in a very intense way, which was good. And you would think hopefully that would have pointed towards something to build upon, but it really didn't, as we know, sadly.
Well, we'll have a link to that. I'll send you that again, and we'll have a link to that final, that Chick Hearn narrated final on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com when we post this episode. But despite some of those beginnings, right, it seems like, they got through the first year, the two leagues, but it's very, very clear that the machinations of the businessmen behind both of these leagues were not even close to being realized in terms of financial success and whatnot. So perhaps you can describe what the post-season late 1967 situation was like when both leagues basically realized that, perhaps their greatest dreams were a longer time in coming since that first season.
Yeah, it was They sat down again, all of them. They had to. I mean, the NPSL was threatening an antitrust lawsuit, and you'll see antitrust come up a lot in the history of soccer in the United States. But that was sort of their trump card. I mean, they all sat down and tried, as they did in 1966. They all sat down in the same room and were like, all right, well, let's negotiate. How can we fix this, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very nasty and contentious. And finally, the NPSL, pulled out the trump card. Or, okay, we're going to sue you for antitrust. And I'm sure they would have went through with it, but I don't think anybody had the appetite to do that. And I think the other side was just like, all right, well, let's salvage this. Let's all see if we can make some money together. So a deal was eventually hammered out. And, there were no longer going to be two teams in each city. Teams either folded or were folded together. The Chicago Wolves became the Kansas City Wolves. The New York Generals took over. The New York Skyliners ceased to exist, for example. Things like that. And then a couple franchises, both of the franchises based in Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh and Philly franchises folded. So they streamlined it as much as they could, but then they eventually merged together, which, everyone under the sun knew would have been the right course of action in 1966. Their hands were forced financially, and if they were going to salvage anything, they had to sort of band together. So very contentious negotiations, but by December of 67, they had merged and became what the United Soccer Association was initially slated to be named the North American Soccer League. And that league opened play in 1968 and lasted all the way through to 1964.
Did you get any sense of some of the intrigue behind how these two leagues finally came together in terms of people who approached whom, who any negotiating strength from either side, any of that kind of stuff?
Well, the United Soccer Association basically felt that they held all the cards. They felt because they had the sanction and they had the revenue to go along with that in staging, international exhibition matches, which again, I hate to say a broken record, but I just went over this again in my book this morning. Andrew Bayer had an incredible article, I think 2 or 3 of them. He was really covering sort of the negotiations, and the NPSL went into negotiations, I guess, because they had the lawsuit, stashed in their pocket, but they seemed to go in with this idea that, hey, we're completely equal partners. And I think initially the United Soccer Association people are like, no, you're going to do what we say. We have the upper hand, not you. We'll work with you, but don't act like you're equals right now. And I think Earl Foreman, he was a gentleman who owned the Washington Whips. He eventually there was a negotiating committee, and he was one of those. So I think he was a sort of voice of calmness. Lamar Hunt was, I think, instrumental, and apparently was a really, really sort of soft-spoken guy. I mean, a killer businessman, but, a really, I guess, calming sort of influence when things like this happened. He was obviously involved in the AFL-NFL merger as well. So I think he was one of the people saying, okay, let's try and make this work. The commissioner of the NPSL was a man named Ken Macker. And going back to, again, when I'm talking about this idea of revenue, that was one of the first things he says this to Andrew Bayer, basically, once we finish this, we want our clubs to be able to start playing international competition as soon as possible. Because again, at that time, sadly, that's where the big money was. They wanted to be able to have the New York Generals play Santos, which happened in 1968. So that was, I think, ultimately that's the fact that they had the sanction already, the USA, and that ultimately the folks on the outside looking in, the rogue league, quote unquote, NPSL, they wanted in on that. So I feel like I think that was sort of the ultimate leverage. Obviously the USA wanted the television contract, but I think they were probably, if they really had to tough it out and not merge, I'm pretty sure they would have probably got their own. And at least that was probably their thinking. So I feel like they really didn't have much to fear. I think they didn't want to keep dragging it out and losing money, but I felt like they were confident, from what I can gather, they were confident enough to say, we'll work with you, but we're sort of the higher power here. At least that's what I've been able to discern.
Yeah, I mean, obviously CBS came back for the second year. You had 17 teams now in the newly renamed North American Soccer League, and you eliminated the competition in those cities that we said had two teams in each market. So clearly the streamlining that, for whatever reason of how it happened, finally came about, and apparently the quality of play did improve. I think it's also interesting. My understanding is that the MPSL's unique scoring system, which we really kind of haven't talked about, was retained.
That's right.
And for those unfamiliar, it basically became a nice standard as in the years to come as the NASL found its footing, where it tried to reward scoring and action in the play, right? So awarding points for not only a win, but also for more offensive goal-scoring mindset, which clearly is something that was quite innovative at the time. Maybe you want to give us some sense as to how go ahead, how 68 sort of came about, but including the curious little journey of the Dallas Tornado in their preseason efforts.
Oh my goodness, yes. The scoring system, I think it was universally loathed by anybody who played professionally outside the United States. It was 3 points for a win, and then you could get an additional 3 points. You could get an additional point in the standings for every goal you scored up to 3. So if you won 3-0, you got 6 points, for example. And I think that drove people outside the United States crazy, but the owners were terrified of 0-0 draws. They were terrified of that because that's something American sports we don't have. We don't have ties. And we don't have games where you can go where you don't potentially see any scoring. So on both sides of the aisle, they were terrified about that. The United Soccer Association floated the idea of giving monetary rewards for any game that wasn't, that didn't end scoreless and things like that. So that was definitely something that they were terrified about. They wanted Americans to see this game and see that, that it wasn't, 1-0, 0-0. So they were very much worried about an increased scoring. The Dallas Tornado, my goodness, they had the right idea. They wanted to build, they had to build their team from scratch. Dundee United went home. They played the part of the Dallas Tornado in the United Soccer Association inaugural season. They went home to Scotland. So now Lamar Hunt and people had to build this team from the ground up. So they, again, typically they got people from Liverpool who, maybe kicked around Everton's youth system at one point in time, but, weren't quite good enough to make it in England. So they recruited a bunch of people like that. And they said, okay, we're going to have a team building exercise. We're going to book you guys essentially on a world tour. And they toured for, it's just incredible. They toured for I want to say maybe 6 months. They played all over the world. They played in Iran. They played in Vietnam while right after the Tet Offensive had happened. It was absolutely amazing. They were playing royal teams. They were playing select. They played the Indian Navy, the Iranian Navy. It was just incredible. They played a Japanese team in right after Christmas. Sponsored by Mitsubishi. They would play professional teams whenever they could, mostly in Central America. But this tour was just so, it's so incredible. It could be a book on its own. When I was doing research about it, I was trying to track down to see if maybe I could interview some of the men, because I think almost all of them are still living. And they were going to have, I saw in The Guardian, there was an article about them that I used, and they were going to have a reunion. I don't know if that was in 2014 or 2015, but they were going to have a reunion. And there's some photo evidence of this. I was able to get as many of the newspaper clippings as I could to sort of document this tour. And there's a lot about it in my book, but it was just absolutely amazing. So these poor guys, they survive this tour. They get to the United States ready to play the season, and they're just basically just flat out exhausted. and they ended up being one of like the worst franchises in the history of American sports. At one point, they may have finished the season like this, but at one point their goal differential was minus 81. I mean, it ended up being a debacle when they actually had to go and play as the Dallas Tornado in the NASL. But the story sort of in soccer lore of this tour is just, it's amazing, but it actually didn't do what they wanted it to do in terms of results on the field.
Yeah, the coach was a guy named Bob Kapp. He led the Tornado in their regular season. Well, actually, he was fired before the season actually really finished. But their final record that year was 2-26-4. And you may not know this, there is a book actually devoted to it that I have yet to find the author of. It's called The Amazing World Tour of the Dallas Tornado. It is written by a guy named Fon Stuffles. And I think
I just saw that.
Yeah, I think it was published in. It's published out of. I want to say out of the Netherlands. So it's absolutely something that we're going to want to pursue, because I do think you're right that it's got to be just an amazing, interesting story. But look, remember Dallas Tornado, Lamar Hunt and friends. And arguably Lamar Hunt was probably the longest standing booster of this sport in this country, right? Not necessarily a bad concept, right? But the idea though of ensuring that would be the way to prepare a team for only its second season. Actually, it's really first season as a professional team in this country. An amazing, interesting asterisk in the history of this sport in this country.
Definitely, they play. I have it in front of me now. They played 32 games across 5 continents, 26 countries over a 7-month period. I mean, that is just hard to fathom. That's really amazing. And Bob Kapp, he's an interesting guy as well, because he was Hungarian, and apparently he was a journalist. There was some sort of soccer magazine or newsletter or something in Canada, and he apparently, from what I can tell, allegedly fudged his resume and said he had some sort of association with Manchester United, which is one of the reasons he sort of got this job anyway. And apparently a lot of this was his idea. And I think I think he liked the game, but he didn't know a lot about it. I think he was just hands off. So he probably said, okay, yeah, take it and run with it. But yeah, even amongst the people involved, there's a lot of interesting crevices of history I've found in this episode.
Well, 1968 was not much better, right? And matter of fact, attendance seemed to be actually worse, even across with all the consolidation. It was only 3,400 a game. At what point in your research were you able to tell that even with CBS back, even with the quality of play improved, even with some interesting stories and games and whatnot, but terrible attendance, the red ink just continued to flow, right? And at what point do you think
it did?
The folks kind of recognized that even this was not necessarily going to make things happen to the extent that they wanted to, and maybe the wheels were truly fully coming off?
I think probably even by like the middle of the season. I mean, the best crowds they drew all that year, where they had Santos play like almost. I think Santos played like 10 of the 17 teams. So they kind of, I don't know if they like took a break in the middle or whatever, but I think again, once they realized that the foreign teams, like internationally known teams, were the only real draws. Actually, no, that's the famous year too, where the Oakland Clippers beat Manchester City. Manchester City had won the English First Division that year, and they came over to tour America, and they actually lost to the Oakland Clippers. And that became like a big deal in United States soccer lore. But I think in terms of the day-to-day, like when it was just the New York Generals versus the Washington Whips, I think the writing on the wall became pretty apparent very close into that season that things were not going well. Things were maybe not going to be sustainable. And I think the men involved, I think they realized that it was going to be harder than they thought. The money men, the owners of like the football and baseball teams. I think a lot of them were like, I'm not sure I want to invest 5 years of my life in this, or 10 years, and, untold thousands, maybe even millions of dollars before I see any positivity result from it. So I think I'm just going to, I'm going to go back to my baseball team, and I think I'm okay with that. I think there was definitely a lot of that. There were only a handful of true believers. I think when the going really got tough, well, probably maybe midway through the 68 season, I think a lot of people who weren't fully committed to the game were like, okay, I'll probably got to cut my losses after this season. And that's exactly what happened. By the end of 1968, there were only 5 teams left. And they decided in 1969 to sort of resurrect the doppelganger idea, where they had West Ham come and play as the Baltimore Bays. They did an exhibition schedule where the 5 doppelganger teams that were imported in. Kilmarnock made another appearance, for example. Aston Villa was another. These teams all played each other for a few weeks, and then the real Bays after that came out and played a schedule, and et cetera. It was really kind of a last gasp thing. So I guess, sorry, to answer your question, I think it became apparent pretty quickly in 1968 that the merger wasn't the magic wand either.
It almost seems that by the end of that 68 season, that most of with maybe the exception of Lamar Hunt, most of the business people essentially abandoned the sport. And the folks that kind of picked it up in 69 and 70, in particular, people like Phil Woosnam and Clive Toy at the time, really were soccer people, right, that kind of inherited whatever was left over and kind of strung things together until the next chapter of what became the NASL's ascendance in the years to come. But maybe you can give some sense of, I guess, the just the feeling around people in the sport come 69 and 70. When you go from 3 professional groups of people wanting to inject life into the professional version of this sport just a few years earlier to really 5 teams left after millions and millions of dollars of lost time and energy and dollars. I can't imagine that, was aside from the truest of believers, that many people saw that there was a hope for this sport in this country in 1969 professionally.
Oh, it was dire. I mean, there's a quote from Woosnam in my book from the Baltimore Sun where he was just like, it was just bleak. It was like pitch black. It was literally was on life support. I mean, they didn't know how they could, 69 was sort of like a Hail Mary. Like, it was so interesting. It was like almost like a closed circle in a way. Like at that point in time, it was a coup for them to get West Ham to come over and play as the Baltimore Bays as the first half of this weird sort of hybrid schedule, because the West Ham at that point in time was playing like, I guess they were kind of almost like the Barcelona of their day. I mean, they were playing like this really beautiful, like flowing, attacking football. And they had 2 or 3 players on that team that played on the 1966 English, national team, the World Cup winning team, including Jeff Hurst, who had scored a hat trick in the final. Sir Bobby Moore was on that team. And I think Martin Peters, I think they were all on that West Ham team. So going with the narrative, I literally have a clipping from the Baltimore Sun, like, cause West Ham couldn't even draw well that summer. And it was like they literally say in the Sun, this clipping I have, it's like Jeff Hurst, he's the man who sort of started all this business in America. 20 million American eyeballs saw him score 3 goals on NBC, in the World Cup finals. And now here he is in the flesh to sort of kickstart this thing, and people are still staying home. People aren't coming. And I think that's why it was so hard for Woosnam and them. It's like if these world-class athletes can't draw, to save this sport here, then what are we going to do? How are our homegrown people going to be able to do this? So it was really a conundrum. And going all the way back to Bill Cox at the beginning of our conversation, that was his thing. It's like, well, as soon as people get exposed to a West Ham type of team here in America, they'll come around. They'll see how beautiful this game actually is. And they'll come and they'll pay to see it, and et cetera. And at that point in time, it was such a low the sport was at such a low ebb here that proved not to be true. So they were really the people that still were invested in, and I would say Woosnam and Hunt would probably be the two most crucial figures of this period, at least in my view. If for them, there's no way the league would have survived. There's no way. And in 1970, I want to say, I think they went into the league with the same 5 teams or maybe less. I know Rochester Americans won the NESL that year, I believe. But that was 69-70 was probably definitely the lowest of lows for that league and for the game on a professional level at that time. And then 71, there's a little bit of breathing room. And then 72, there's a buzz. And then Pele drops in not long after that. And then, you have the once-in-a-lifetime era and all of that stuff. But at that point in time, it definitely was dire. And I think even optimistic people like Hunt and Woosnam were like, we don't know what to do next. We've tried everything. That's the thing. I don't think, again, I mentioned it earlier, but I don't think someone like Lamar Hunt knew how to market soccer. He knew he could market things, but he didn't know how to, you know what I mean? They knew that people would come to see it in America, but they just didn't know how to reach those people. And I think a lot of those people were not like your most prized demographic of the 1960s. There was sort of still second and third generation Americans who their purchasing power wasn't what it is now. You know what I mean? People they weren't typically used to marketing to. I think that was one reason why they didn't know how to get these people to actually turn out. But I mean, there were a lot of factors, but yes, that was definitely probably the lowest ebb until probably the 1980s when the NASL folded, and before we got the World Cup and then the Major League Soccer and things like that.
Yeah, and this dance between, quote unquote soccer people and quote unquote business people, right? And rarely do the two or had the two or even today in some respects do the two intersect. You sort of have the wild dreams and maybe not, incorrectly so about, professional sports entrepreneurs recognizing the quote unquote next big thing. But, look, soccer is unique and continues to be so. It is the world's game. It is a sport that, unlike most of the professional sports in this country, is not necessarily born and invented here in the United States. We are not the best players of that sport in the world. And it continues to flummox folks who see business opportunities, who see stadium scenarios, who see approaches to salaries and television revenue, et cetera, who are stymied sometimes by the seemingly questionable and or non-business-like approaches to the world's game in all its complexity. I will end on this, though. You do have one interesting little chapter in your book about one team that arguably could have been part of the NASL in 1969 and maybe be the 6th team, but chose a different path, those being the California now Clippers. They kind of pursued sort of an exhibition path instead of, right, playing in the league.
Yes, they did. And again, and I think that's because their owners saw that that's how they could still make money. And they did. It was incredible. They played... They scored victories over Manchester City. They scored victories over Dynamo Kiev. They had victories over Fiorentina, who had won the title in Italy in either 1968 or 1969. I mean, they were scheduling matches with these like international global powers. Like once they decided to not be under the rubric of the NASL, they were like certified by like the California State Soccer Association or something, and eventually the USSFA stepped in, and they eventually had money problems as well. But the USSFA was going to sort of put tamp down on them, because they were making money outside of the sanctioned rubric of we're going to get a cut of that. And the other dangerous thing about them is that other teams threatened to do what they were doing. The New York Generals threatened to do what they were going to do and just sort of go independent and schedule, matches at Roosevelt Stadium or whatever. We'll get AC Milan to come in and we'll play them and Roma or whoever. So the Clippers went on this like really incredible voyage for about a year, where they just sort of independently scheduled exhibitions in California and beyond, and they played like a lot of the who's who of that day. And it was really fascinating, and I was lucky enough to be able to interview the general manager of that team, like I had mentioned before, Derek Leakey. So I got some good insight onto how the team was put together, and it was incredible. Like, it was this fusion of players from the former Yugoslavia and from places like Costa Rica, and they just meshed. Two entirely different cultures and even ways of playing the game. And they just really meshed together. I mean, they had an incredible coach, and it just worked. And they were able to sort of live out these dream of there was a great quote about them. They were financed in Texas. They were birthed in Europe, or they were financed in Texas. They were staffed by Europe and Central American employees. They trained in California, but they became truly American in their ability to sort of adapt to sort of melting pot ethos. They could have emblematically been like a really exciting success story. They could have pointed the way forward to American soccer. And again, it was like one of these weird near misses. This was happening right at this exact same time that I'm talking about being the lowest ebb in the history of the sport, and at that point in time. And there's all this acrimony, and there's mergers and teams folding. Meanwhile, this team's staging exhibitions against Dynamo Kiev, who were like a European power, and they played a 3-match series against them, and it was a complete stalemate. 1 loss, 1 draw, 1 victory. I mean, it was really amazing.
Well, it's a fascinating chapter in the history of professional soccer in this country, and I think as we see the success of Major League Soccer, we debate about how the sport is governed going forward with the new president of the U.S. Soccer Federation and the U.S. Soccer Organization, the inability to qualify for the World Cup despite progress or seeming progress over the decades since the 90s. Some of these issues, though, some of these themes are still very much with us, and it's really important to understand how those themes perhaps began and in some respects haven't fully been solved yet. But I think every generation thinks that when they discover or they see certain things, that's all new and uncharted territory. But, we look back, and which is partially why we do some of these silly podcasts, right? To look back into some of these things that, the proverbial those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And, professional soccer in this country has never been a straight line. And the initial forays into drawing those lines began around this period of time, which is what makes this book fascinating, and this topic similarly. Do you want to give us some promotional goodness as to where we can find the book, and maybe even what you might be working on or thinking about going forward, either this sport or other projects in general?
Oh, well, thank you very much. The book is called The Rebirth of Professional Soccer in America. It was published by Rowman and Littlefield. You can find it pretty much anywhere you go to look for books. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble's website. You can order it directly from Rowman and Littlefield on their website. I believe you can even get it on Target or Walmart on their websites as well. Right now, after I did this book, I took a break. I still have all my research that I used for this book, and there's still some interesting, I'm hoping, avenues to explore further about this. One of the things I was looking at is the history of factory teams, because I found the existence of the factory teams, or I'm sure you know this, where this game started, like Bethlehem Steel in 1919. That's like sort of where it started here in America. Those are like the first major teams, like where factories would sponsor these teams. And there's a lot of research done about those types of teams in the Northeast. But I've discovered evidence of teams like that in the South and even in the Pacific Northwest. Boeing had one, for example. So that's something, I don't know what the audience for that would be, but that's one thing I was considering about maybe doing some research on. And I'm still really interested in the game. I'm kind of hoping. I'm also a huge music fan, so I have some research topics in music that I'm looking at, but nothing concrete right now. Thank you, though, for the opportunity to for me to talk about that. Though I really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, it's a tremendous book, a very interesting read. And again, if you call yourself a soccer fan in this country, and to not know the nooks and crannies of the rebirth, I guess, of top-tier professional soccer in this country around the late 1960s and even prior, you owe it to yourself to grab a copy and devour this book as I did and have. I can't thank you enough. This has been awesome. I look forward to staying in touch, and I also throw the challenge out to our listeners, and I'm overwhelmed and surprised by how this podcast has, despite all the odds, sort of permeated certain nooks and crannies of sports intelligentsia out there to find perhaps some of the missing pieces of media that we kind of alluded to before. Certainly the CBS broadcasts of the NPSL and then later NASL in 1967 and 68. We obviously love to talk to Jack Whitaker and see if he can bring us some memories of that. Maybe some of the old ISL, International Soccer League broadcasts. Again, we think WPIX New York, now owned by Tribune, had a bunch of games on the air, and CBS certainly broadcast some snippets of some of those finals as well. We'd love to find some of that video and I think add to the archival history of this sport in this country. So the challenge has been laid out and laid bare. Let's hope we can maybe collectively try to figure out some of those things. And you know what? It also may not be a bad timing for this conversation and that call to arms, so to speak, because as you probably are aware, the National Soccer Hall of Fame will be relaunching in its new digs in Frisco, Texas. We understand later this year, probably the fall or early winter of 2018. And obviously great opportunity to not only renew interest in this chapter of professional soccer in this country, but perhaps start to find and diligently secure some of those pieces of tape and video and other archival stuff that for whatever reason still remain elusive. So I don't know. Let's collectively make a pact to see if we can find some of this stuff, huh?
Definitely. I'm in. I think that would be fantastic for the world to be able to see some of this stuff. I'm dying to see it myself.
It continues to be a fascinating topic, and I still think there are lots of nooks and crannies yet to be explored in that story, the birth, the rebirth, the full-fledged efforts, misguided and misinformed as they might have been, noble in pursuit, perhaps on some levels, folly on others. The professional soccer rebirth, shall we say, in the United States of the late 1960s, and a very interesting story. The book that Dennis has written is chock full of good stuff, very well researched, and strangely, really one of the only books kind of focused on this topic. And I suspect, as the National Soccer Hall of Fame gets rebooted later this year in suburban Dallas and Frisco, the rethinking and the rediscovery, I guess, of some of the earliest days of pro soccer, at least the modern day version of such, will start to come out, and hopefully a little bit more detail. As you can clearly tell, there are some interesting things that are still out there. We, for example, would love to find some time to talk to Jack Whitaker, if he is willing and able to talk more about some of his early days at CBS, covering a little bit of the ISL as well as the initial NPSL games. Obviously, he was part of CBS's coverage as they sort of came and went over the years. He had a seminal commentary after Pele's first game with the New York Cosmos in 1975. That is an amazing YouTube clip. We'll try to put that up on our website for you all to enjoy, that harkens back to these days of 1967 and 68. And so he's somebody we want to get. We clearly also have tons of video to find, whether they be snippets of the games from CBS in those early years, etc. We put that out to our audience as well. And let's not forget the book. The book is called The Rebirth of Professional Soccer in America by our guest Paul Reese, subtitled The Strange Days of the United Soccer Association. That is available wherever fine books are found. It is published by our friends at Rowman and Littlefield. You can find a link to that book on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And that, of course, is tied to episode 47. You will see that listed with a whole bunch of other stuff, including we had a couple of other links up there, too. You will find a link to the book that we talked about as well, and I'd love to get the author at some point of that, called The Amazing World Tour of the Dallas Tornado by Fons Stuffles. And that is an interesting book as well. That's the story of the Bob Cap-led, Lamar Hunt-owned Dallas Tornado in their sort of preseason tour that basically led to disaster in the first year of the full-fledged NASL in 1968, but a crazy story that. And also, for the full background to this conversation, I highly encourage you, if you have not listened to it already, is our episode number 6, back from last spring, with our friend columnist Paul Gardner, the dean of soccer columnists in this country. And you'll remember in that conversation, we talk at length, extensively about Paul's early days in the United States as a fledgling writer and his involvement with some of the topics we talked about today, the International Soccer League, Bill Cox in particular, the United Soccer Association. We get into Madison Square Garden being one of the owners of one of the teams and their perhaps misguided attempts to make a mint, if you will, with this sort of soccer thing without, of course, being really knowledgeable about the inner workings of soccer. So that's a fascinating conversation with Paul Gardner. That's our episode number 6. You'll find a link to that, of course, on our website, too. Again, as you can imagine, if you haven't sort of figured it out already, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's the website. That's where all of our old episodes are. That's where all the links to all kinds of media live. You'll see all kinds of fun imagery there. You will also find links to our social profiles. And again, if you want to go to those things too and follow us in all those places, please, by all means. At Twitter, we are at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you will find us at Good Seats Still Available. And of course, on Facebook, you'll find a page devoted to us as well. So give us some likes and some emoji love there too. We appreciate that. If you want to send us some email, just go to our website. You'll find a link to us there. Yada, yada, and yada. Last but not least, we want to thank our friends at Podfly Productions. In particular, yes, there he is, the king of all kings of audio and podcast production, Jerry Payne, the man who puts it all together for us and makes it sound halfway decent. And we appreciate Jerry's yeoman-like effort every week to put up with me and us to make this thing sound halfway decent. Podfly Productions, podfly.net is the website. Check them out, especially if you're interested in podcasting. You will be happy that you did. Okay, thanks very much for listening. We will talk to you next week. God knows what topic, but I guarantee it'll be interesting. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it tremendously. And until then, take care, everybody.